scheme, but flood risk assessment is something that has been established firmly in various industries. It was developed for the nuclear industry, then made it into the hazardous waste industries, then into the geotechnical industries, and now into flood risk assessments. Terrorism is assessed pretty much with the same principle, where you, let's just jump to the third, where you estimate the risk. And estimating the risk doesn't mean you just determine the 200-year flood return period level and then determine how many people may die or what the economic losses is. No, you look at perhaps the 50-year event, the 100-year event, the 200, the 500, perhaps the 1,000-year event, and then you determine the risks and the consequences for each one of these scenarios. And then you figure out where the tax dollar is spent most wisely. Because it may be that it is the 100-year flood that you should mitigate against, particularly in a floodplain where there is hardly any development and where the consequences are close to nil. But it may be, as in the case of the Fraser River, where you ought to design against and mitigate against the 1,000-year or 2,000-year flood. Ridiculous? I don't think so. The Dutch are designing typically for the 2,500-year return period flood from the rivers, the Meuse and the Rhine rivers, and for the 1 in 10,000-year flood event from ocean-borne floods. Shouldn't come as a surprise because 2/3 of the Netherlands are below sea level. Then you evaluate risk. So saying this is the risk level is one thing, but then you need to go a step further and say, well, what constitutes tolerable risk? Tolerable risk is what does society, by and large, say that we can deal with, that much money we'll pay for the benefits that we gather, and that is what we cannot tolerate. And then you need to control the risk. Next slide, please. All this you can assess in so-called risk matrices. I'm not going to lead you through it in any detail, but there is a scheme to all this. You determine the probability of events, that's on the axis on the left side, and you determine the consequences. Those are the different categories in the bottom side. And this risk matrix can guide you through whether you're dealing with a high risk or a low risk or a very high risk. So, on to Salmon River. We were retained by the Water Organization to review the current information pertaining to risks on Salmon River Delta. So this is, what we've done is not one of these full-blown flood risk assessments or quantitative flood risk assessments that I've been talking about, but we've reviewed what do we know and what do we not know. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now. So these are some of the consultant reports that we sifted through. This is not the entire information that we were given by Water, but those are some of the more salient reports that we extracted information. So just to know what is out there and where are the gaps in our knowledge. So past development, we know the CP rail line was completed in 1885 at the toe of the delta. We know that highway number 1, highway bridge was constructed crossing Salmon River. We also know that from the Dobson engineering report in 2007 that it does not meet the 200-year return period criterion at this point in time. We know that agricultural development has occurred in the watershed, and that agricultural development, which is not unique to this watershed or this river, it's very similar to very many rivers in BC, in Canada, and in the world, has removed riparian vegetation, has simplified the channel in some areas. Riparian vegetation is extremely important because the roots, in very simple terms, the roots hold together the banks by so-called root cohesion, providing stability to the banks. If you remove the riparian vegetation, the river has a much easier time to erode. It erodes, the channel widens, the channel gets shallower, the water temperatures increase, and the river channel becomes more unstable, thereby eroding into agricultural land. So it's a bit of an irony. In order to gain more agricultural land, one does sort of the opposite. Forestry occurred in the upper watershed, of course, as everywhere in BC. And forestry does influence, we know that, watershed hydrology. It very much depends on how much is being cut, what the species distribution were, how fast it regrows, what hypsometry or area elevation distribution there was, etc., etc. And now we have the mountain pine beetle that munches down the lodgepole pines at an unprecedented rates, and that, of course, also that high tree mortality changes the watershed hydrology. Okay, small regulating structure. So if we look at the time series of peak instantaneous annual floods, we detect a small upward trend. I have no idea, we haven't analyzed why, we don't know why that is. Is it persistent or is it just a phase change? We don't know. We do not detect such positive trend on the lake levels. In fact, there is a very slight, however statistically insignificant declining trend. So that relates to that data stationarity issue that I've mentioned earlier. So once again, I'm not trying to find the culprits of why that is occurring. I'm just pointing out what we know at this point and what we don't. Interestingly enough, are the peak flood estimates expressed in cubic meters per second that are being used in order to mitigate flood hazard and flood risk. So the one that is still being used is the one that was estimated by Crippen in 1990, and that's 59 cubic meters per second. It was revised by Dobson in 2007. It was a longer record, of course, 17 years more of data, to 75, and our firm quickly revised that again using an average of 4 extreme value statistics methods, and we came up with 77. So now you see, of course, there's a profound difference between 59 and 77. That discharge translates into a different stage, and therefore also into a different area inundated. In how far the area inundation, the area potentially inundated changes, we don't know. That will require 1 or 2-dimensional flood modeling with that particular input parameter of 77. That 77 is a mean value. The prediction intervals for the statistics we use would certainly be higher. It could be in 85 or so. In a flood risk assessment, you use the entire spectrum of predicted values, not just the mean value. Very big difference. We know that the Canadian Pacific Railway obstructs the natural flow path and increases sedimentation rate in flood peaks. At the time it was built, changes in sedimentation rates on Salmon River was definitely not of a concern, and it's hard to imagine that anybody would deconstruct the CP railways. Future flow obstructions, of course, may have similar effects. Whenever you put something in the way of a river, it will flow around it. It will change the hydrology nearby by scour, by a backwater effect, whatever it may be. Low flows are exacerbated by water withdrawals and perhaps even by an increasingly drying and a climate that is getting increasingly warmer, particularly during the summer months. What we don't know about flood hydrology is the cause in the increasing trend that I've mentioned earlier, the negative trend in lake levels. We believe that the stationarity assumption that I addressed earlier is increasingly being violated, and that the statistical or stochastic methods being used are possibly no longer valid. So if this trend was to continue, then the question is, what would the Q200-year return period be in 50 or 100 years? Water also paid for new LiDAR data. LiDAR is a radar that is mounted at the bottom of an airplane or helicopter and creates exact topography. This exact topography with 30 centimeter contours allows modeling of floods to very high precision that one really can see where the flood goes to. And then, of course, changes in groundwater flow due to any proposed developments. We know a fair bit about the fluvial geomorphology. You can read the slide yourself, but in essence, the changes on the floodplain because of agriculture have changed dramatically river widths and river behavior. We also know that there's a whole bunch of landslides in the watershed. These landslides have connectivity to the floodplain through these debris flows that can transport tens of thousands of cubic meters of material in one go all the way to the floodplain. And we know a little bit about the historic delta evolution through a comparative study of air photograph. What we don't know are the exact channel aggregation and degradation rates, so how fast the riverbed builds up or in sizes, because that requires a repeat cross-section measurements. We don't know the rates, again, the numerical values of delta aggregation. We don't know what the long-term forcings are. We know there is these forcings, but we don't know what exact role or what percentage change they precipitate. We know little about the channel response to delta infringement. We know little about the various backwater effects. You can only know about them if you put them into numerical models. And we don't know much about the velocity changes and associated bank erosions under different development scenarios. We know a fair bit of what fish there are, or more importantly, there were, because the salmon population has been reduced very dramatically over the last 30 years, as you can see from the graph on the right. And we know that unless there's a profound change, salmon may never come back to the numbers that we have observed in the early parts of the century. That water level fluctuations are critical for several wetland species. We know that flora and fauna communities are interlinked, they need each other. We know that wetlands provide water purification and nutrient retention, as well as provide a lot of recreational value. In fact, I'm building what is called in Germany a Schwimmteich for myself. It's sort of a neat thing. You have 2 ponds, just going to tell you about that really quickly. One to swim in, so no, it's not a sterile swimming pond, it's sort of like a whatever shape you want to dig out. And then you have a little regeneration area where you put water plants in it. You pump water between the 2 systems, and your swimming area is beautifully clear water, and you don't never need any chlorine or ozone or nothing. Loss of riparian vegetation and delta channel complexity can lead to, there's a few examples, high water temperatures, loss of refugia, loss of nutrient transport. What we don't know is about flora and floral succession, bird wintering habitat and migration issues, evaluation of ecological values, and a quantitative assessment of available fish habitat. So if I summarize, there is quite a bit of knowledge out there. It's certainly a well-studied watershed. We know a fair bit about fluvial geomorphology. However, it has never really been integrated with the flood hydrology. We know now that the 200-year return period estimate that is still being used as a design basis is probably 30% too low. We also know that the Trans-Canada Highway Bridge is probably a significant flood hazard. It's the only throughlet of the river if it was to be blocked either by exceeding its capacity or being blocked by organic debris that floats against it. The upstream areas would flood and would flood quickly. We know that intensive agricultural vegetation removal has led to bank erosion and bank instabilities, whose effects are still being noticeable today. There is a chasm between what has been analyzed and what can be analyzed. So not all the scientific tools that are there have been used. In our opinion, any users of the delta and the associated wetlands should base their decision on best science, because in the absence of that knowledge, any such decisions will be inferior. These floodplain and delta preservation would serve a number of objectives. It would reduce flood risk, it would preserve goods and services, it would create more resiliency to potential climate change impacts through so-called ecosystem-based adaptation. And rather than sterilizing floodplains or deltas, one ought to use an approach that integrates the various interest groups but provides a much more ecological approach to managing flood risk. So we know for facts that floodplains and deltas are the most threatened global ecosystem. We know they are also the most valuable in terms of species distribution and biodiversity. developed countries are spending more and more effort, money, and resources to identify and preserve those wetlands. And in this particular case, we know that it is one of the most pristine environments that have been mapped for these types of ecosystems in British Columbia. So, and that pretty much concludes my talk. I hope a bit of a stoic approach to flood risk, but it doesn't seem to be too unhappy. So I think the question will be postponed to the panel discussion, and with that I thank you for your patience and attention.